Hello, my name is Carl Letamendi, and I am just making this video because I had a lot of students that I'm helping with their dissertation now that I'm done with my dissertation, and this video is kind of meant for you all to get a feel for what a dissertation presentation should look like. Um, the dissertation that I made follows the same format of the 5 chapters in the actual dissertation. So I just wanted to create this video so that you can have as a reference or as a guide um, for when you are ready to do your dissertation. So the title of my dissertation was Identifying the Factors that Influence Changes in Aggregate Sentiment Among the Masses, an Analysis of the Measure of Consumer Sentiment through a Conflict Analysis and Resolution Lens. Presented to the Graduate School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Nova Southeast University, partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, and I did successfully complete my dissertation, and I defended on May 15th, 2014. So now, very happy camper because that was a lot of work. So the first slide here that I have is a presentation outline. I start off with the acknowledgements, then I start explaining how I came up with the topic, an introduction of the dissertation, and then this is actually chapter 1. Then I go on to talking about my literature review, which is actually your chapter 2. Then my methodology, which is chapter 3. The results, which is chapter 4. And then conclusions, which is actually chapter 5. So then there you have it. I actually did this presentation exactly using the format of the written work. So for my acknowledgement, I started off by thanking my wife, Jasmine Letamendi, for putting up with me for that time that I was doing the dissertation, for waking up with me super early, staying up real late in the evenings, and for really just being like a great um, helper in other areas. There was also a couple other people who I wanted to thank. Kafele Kalfani, who was influential in helping to distribute my survey to as many people as he possibly could. Lisette Martinez from Wayne State University, Catherine Pizzella from University of Maine, Diana Thomas, Nova Southeast University, Luz from University of Illinois, University of Michigan Survey Research Center, which is one of the entities that gave me the opportunity to use one of the surveys that they employ, and specifically Rebecca McBee for helping to explain how to do the study. The U.S. Department of Education, Institute of Education Science, National Center for Education Statistics, and I put them here in the acknowledgments because they also helped to. They also gave me permission to use part of one of their surveys in part of mine. My committee members, which were the 3 dissertation chairs, then George Katona and Eva Mueller, who were fundamental at the University of Michigan's Survey Research Center, because when this economist Eva Mueller and this psychologist George Katona put their heads together and they divided the walls that divided their fields, they came up with this great measure called the Index of Consumer Sentiment, which is a significant part of my study. And then Dr. Jose de Letamendi, which has my last name. He's actually an epidemiologist and professor and political scientist, economist of the mid 1800s of Spain. And his multidisciplinary approach, and also the possibility that he can be related to me, was influential in just being able to have an open mind in this entire process. And his writings were, although I didn't use them for my literature review or anything like that, they kind of inspired me to go the way that I did. The next thing that I did in my dissertation presentation is I explained the topic development. I provided a little bit of background about myself, that I was an undergrad in business. I got a master's degree in finance, But I developed an interest in researching society as an interconnected system. I didn't really want to get into like investment banking or anything like that. I actually was more enthused about learning about how finance has an influence in society, how how having a good economy or having a bad economy can influence society and the entire social system as a whole. So when I was shopping around for PhD programs, I wanted to do a PhD kind of like maybe in like organizational psychology, but not really. Something more along the lines of like systemic or societal psychology. So based on the fact that I was already here in South Florida, and my family's here and everything like that, so I just decided that the PhD in conflict analysis and resolution, which was a degree in social science, which is the direction that I wanted to go in, was a good fit. Then I developed particular research interest, which was a broad, specific subject that has broad content, right? Analyzing large social conflicts. So that's the direction that I wanted to go in. I wanted to contribute a new approach to the field of conflict analysis, which can be applied to many other fields to extend the academic capacity. So a lot of people in the field of conflict analysis and resolution want to be mediators or people who do peace and stuff. That's great, but I didn't want to go in that direction. I wanted to take the social scientist route and analyze conflicts so that someone else, like a practitioner, could take steps to resolve those conflicts because you need that background first, too. ADR is trending, but there's someone who is playing tug of war with us, and that's the field of law. So lawyers uh, are also applying ADR in their practice. They're also mediators and arbiters and all this other stuff. So um, we also have to consider like looking forward into our field of conflict analysis and resolution in 10 or 20 years, will we be the mediators or will they be the mediators? Well, the field of jurisprudence has been around for much longer than the field of conflict analysis or resolution, so it all depends on what the public perceives. If people think that lawyers make better mediators, for example, then what's going to happen 20 years down the line? Is our field going to end because it's comprised of majority mediators? Or are we also going to be able to provide some theoretical perspective or or to also act kind of like the demographers of the field of conflict analysis? So that was me. And I wanted to consolidate finance, economics, psychology, social sciences, and the systems perspective. That's what I wanted to do. So now introduction, which is equivalent to the chapter 1 in the study. I provided a background here. Under and unemployment, increases in crime, companies outsourcing, bankruptcy, foreclosures, etc., are all blamed on what is called the quote, the bad economy. So we see kind of like this as the cause and then FX. A fractured economy propels social conflict. So, for example, when unemployment is down, crime goes up. And there's an opposite relationship too. When employment is high, crime is low. So people in society have to eat. They have to, they have to survive. So some people will eventually um, resort to doing things that they would normally consider to be unethical for their needs. So the people's priority will always be to first satisfy their physiological needs using any means necessary. So I wanted to study that. Conflict is defined as a struggle between two or more interconnected parties experiencing differences in needs and values, and that's Katzenlawyer 93. So this is a picture that I provided to show different stakeholders in society. Here we have a consumer, for example, and the consumer has a relationship with producers because producers produce for the consumer, right? And the reason why the consumer consumes is because there's demand, which keeps the producers employed. If this producers um, does not spend money, the demand is down, therefore demand for employment is down. So then even right here in just these two images, there's a relationship, right? There's also a relationship between the small business owner and also producers, right? Because producers provide um, the materials or the inventory for the small business person to operate, which also depends on the consumer. The consumer also has a relationship with the government with the small business owner, the government with people and society as a whole, society with the government, job hunters with the government, job hunters with employment opportunities, job hunters with graduates who are competing for jobs. Um, Graduates are looking for work, so it's kind of like a system that's interconnected. When you look at the society and consumer research. Problem statement. Most people don't understand the economy and how it works, and as such are influenced to feel a certain way about the economy by other factors. And this was something that was studied over 50, 60 years ago when economic measures such as the Consumer Price Index, the Index of Consumer Sentiment, which is what my study's on, the Index of Consumer Confidence, and the Index of Consumer Expectations were developed. These all have a direct impact on things such as inflation, the value of the dollar, etc., and need to be revised because of fluctuating aggregate behaviors. So basically, these measures measure how people feel about the state of the economy. This one, and this one. And when people feel bad about the state of the economy, they tend to spend less, which is bad because when you spend less, there's less demand. Less demand means there's less unemployment. Now, there's less employment rather, and if there's less employment, less there's going to be high crime, higher need for police funding, higher need for taxes. So it's kind of like a system whereby if you can kind of start to perceive that aggregate consumer sentiment is the start point for all other things, good or bad, that result from the economy, a good one or a bad one. How people feel towards the state of the economy has the ability to influence other behaviors, and this has been proven statistically, such as political leadership. Um, so if you feel positive about the state of the economy or negative, it has the ability to influence who you're gonna pledge your allegiance to when it comes to your political leaders. The problem statement. People's behaviors change relative to the conditions and externalities that are in place and cause them to spend a certain way and feel a certain way about the state of the economy. If consumer sentiment is so critical to everything else that follows after aggregate actions are made, such as spending and saving, then it is critical to understand what factors, individual characteristics, and experiences influence sentiment to learn how sentiment can be manipulated. So basically, this is what I did just to kind of like illustrate the chart, right? So there's been 50 years of research that has studied consumer sentiment, and 50 plus years of studying consumer sentiment's relationship to the stock market, consumer sentiment's relationship to spending and saving decisions, which leads to all those other bad societal issues, consumer sentiment in gross domestic product, and consumer sentiment in political leadership approval, and many other things, right? But I wanted to go beyond that, or actually before that, and identify what is it that influences consumer sentiment. So the study is significant because I consolidate three main areas. You have economics, finance, and social and behavioral science into this realm of conflict analysis and resolution. When I did my undergrad in business, my master's degree in finance, so that encompasses these two fields here. And when I was doing finance, it also has a big um, decision piece to it, decision sciences. So the decision sciences part in consolidation with what I learned as a student in conflict analysis and resolution gave me these two parts. And then when I meshed the three together, then I came up with the bigger picture of my study. Finance students learn how to calculate interest rates, dividends, interest rates. Did I just do that? Okay, forget this. Finance students learn how to calculate interest rates, dividends, coupon payments, and bonds, etc. This is why it's important to read everything carefully, and also let someone else read your stuff when you're producing your work. Economic students learn about interactions in the market, consumer behavior, and seemingly infinite theories such as those of Smith, Keynes, Marx, Hayek, and Friedman. So um, the study is significant again because finance students learn how to calculate stuff. Economic students, economy students, or students of economics, learn about different theories, right, and stuff. But what I started to think is that like all of the theorists that comprise the field of economics, which is a social science, not not something that would typically be housed in a business school in back in the day. These theorists are old, right? They all produce their theories in the context of their time. They all have lived experience that shaped the way that they thought and they perceived the world. And even though it's nice to read Marx theories and Keynes and Adam Smith theories, the reality is that when it comes to society, society changes over time. Not a little bit, a lot of it. Society changes a lot. And since society changes and is very fluid in the aggregate, we have to continuously, over and over and over, reassess these theories and test to see whether or not they're still applicable. This study inserts the human factor into the equation and recognizes that theories must be reevaluated because humans and their decision-making abilities are never static and society changes and adapts to technological and scientific advances. The study also helps in identifying large-scale conflict, which may help in preventing and resolving social conflict, and introduces a new model for the analysis of large social conflicts, which is after I completed all of my work, the work that I produced is called the theory that I produced is called the cycle of aggregate sentiment, and it's like a theoretical perspective that people in the field of conflict analysis or economics or social science can use to analyze a society or a conflict. So I'll give you an example. We have Adam Smith, right, over here. Um, he was the grandfather of the idea of self-regulation, and he has this idea called the invisible hand theory. All people work harmoniously for the common good, right? That's what he says. Now, I want you to look at when he was born and when he died, okay? Whenever, like, Adam Smith's theories are all over economics text, and this was something that kind of upset me because there are he perceived the world in a certain way, right? He perceived the world Adam Smith's way. But there are factors that went into his being that affected the way that he saw the world. So, one of these things, for example, is that um, he didn't live long enough to witness financial bubbles or the creation of America's first bank, which was established to support the Revolutionary War. He didn't live long enough for that. So if he had witnessed the bank and the idea and the concept of banks, then perhaps his perspective would have changed. He was born and raised in a company in Scotland. He's Scottish, so and he was born and raised in a country that was invaded by the time by England, which was the hegemony of the time. So since he was very like vocal about his ideas and stuff, Adam Smith was perceived kind of like a hippie of his time, like a like someone who fought for the cause, for example, and he wanted to be that person that caused the social movement, right, against England. He was a rebel of his time, and he followed deism as his faith. Now, deism is a religion. They're called Deist, Deist. Okay, people who believe in deism are called Deist, and this religion basically has the concept that God created the earth and everything, but after he created the earth, he left the earth and never came back. So God, to Adam Smith, was never an entity of regulation. So he never believed like in prayer, or he never believed in like just the way that a lot of religions ask for God or ask for their deity for things or for hope or anything like that. That's very important. Why? Because the idea of the invisible hand is a mirror of his religion, of his religious beliefs. So there were a lot of things, his cultural background, his religion, the time that he lived in, and his role in his society that influenced his invisible hand theory. But now, if you fast forward, through a couple hundred years, his perspectives are going to change. So why are we still talking about him in our economics text. It's good to acknowledge him, but we have to continuously reevaluate our theories in order to continue to mold our society. The need for this study. It impacts various fields. Future incomes are impacted by inflation, whose calculation depends on the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index has a direct impact on the value of the dollar and is influenced by spending versus savings decisions, which is influenced by consumer sentiment, which is the emphasis of this study. There is conflict between individuals and the banking world, between the banking world and the government, between borrowers and banks, etc. The system is interconnected. Identifying which factors influence aggregate sentiment can be helpful in restoring social and economic normalcy, raise red flags when a social conflict is foreseeable, and perhaps even implement ways of resolving large-scale, complex conflicts at the political level. So I had two hypotheses because I had a whole bunch of variables that I wanted to test, and I'm not going to have 100 hypotheses. So there I have two. Null hypothesis is H0. There is no statistical significance between consumer sentiment and the given variable. The alternative hypothesis is there exists a strong statistical significance between consumer sentiment and the variable, right? So this is the process. First, we test the null hypothesis, which says there is no statistical significance, and if there is statistical significance, then we move on to the alternative hypothesis, which indicates that there is a strong statistical significance. And then you illustrate, how much of a statistical significance there is based on your statistics. Some of the limitations that I had in my study is that participants were all internet users, people who live in rural areas who don't have access to internet, who can't afford to pay for internet, were not captured in my sample. The study might have been lengthy for some. It was like 40 something questions, and it was limited to opinions in the United States and doesn't provide a cross-national analysis of consumer sentiment, which you could do if you want, or I leave it to the governments to analyze the consumer sentiment of their countries, unless they want to pay me to do it. Key terms: economy, consumer price index, which is, you know what economy is. Consumer price index is a measure that they do every month, which calculates essentially like the average cost of goods and services in society to determine inflation. And inflation is the up and down of the dollar, right? The gross domestic product, which is GDP, basically means the total the total dollar amount of the goods and service of the goods that are produced in a country. All right. A recession is when gross domestic product is down. A regulation is when the government steps in to they stepped in to regulate the economy. Deregulation is when they step back. And the index of consumer sentiment is essentially the measure that I use in my study. So this is chapter 2, which is basically literature review. So in the literature review, I divided it in half. So half of them were themes specific to the economy, and then the other half are the epistemological problems of economics. In the first part of the literature review, I talked about consumer sentiment, the importance of the index of consumer sentiment, the predictive ability of the index of consumer sentiment, and then articles that are specific to greed and financial bubbles over time. In the second part, this one is the part of the literature review which has a little bit more to do with conflict analysis and social theories. It has a little bit of psych in it too, response to stimuli, social theorists, social theories, and then conflict between social classes. Some of the key points in the literature: there are unknown factors which cause economic discomfort. Spending increases when consumers are optimistic about their own future wealth. Awareness of unemployment alone has the ability to dampen consumer sentiment, which is Eva Mueller, one of the pioneers in this kind of research. Regulation is needed to keep the economy ethical. Regulation is needed. Most people who take economic surveys don't know much about the economy and are unaware of distant, ambiguous phenomena. Aggregate sentiment has a strong relationship with approval of political leadership. There's a relationship between the index of consumer sentiment and GDP, but more work is needed to be done to understand what causes sentiment. And that's what I did. The consumer price index of the Netherlands is skewed because of high non-response rates, and this is a study that was done over there. The consumer price index is skewed because it purposefully omit certain trades, one-person households, and did not include major surgeries as such as appendectomies in its calculation. So here we see, I start pulling some articles also in the literature that illustrate the need for my study. And that I did it strategically. So you see skewed, right? Because then this further illustrates that there's a problem that needs to be solved, a problem which I intend to fix through my study. The US may be overstating the rate of inflation because of the consumer price index. Willingness to consume may be an important factor impacting actual consumption. When consumers are optimistic, they save less and spend more. And alternatively, when consumers are pessimistic, they save more and spend less, which is bad for the economy. Sometimes we're told that saving is a good thing, but for the economy, it's not a good thing. In the 1950s, Americans were primarily concerned about automation, which is replacing human jobs, which decrease consumer confidence. So it's funny because in American history, we leave this out, right? Automation, you guys remember the show The Jetsons? And you remember that they had a maid that would go around and do human stuff. So people were scared about this. There was really, really a significant concern that robots would take over human jobs. Now, in our society, people are more concerned about losing jobs due to being shipped to other countries, globalization, and not automation so much, but also there's a strong body of people who are also scared that they're going to lose jobs to immigrants, for example. So when you look at society in any one of the time periods, there's always like an aggregate sentiment that influences people's consumer confidence. Calculus doesn't determine human behavior. Hypotheses must be continuously verified anew by experience. So this is Ludwig von Mises. He was actually like a philosopher, social scientist slash economist um, in the Austrian school of thought. And basically he was meant to be the more like the social science part of my dissertation, the conflict part, the social science part. Consumer optimism is a strong predictor of consumer expenditures, and a theory should be developed about the way perceptions influence behavior. And this was proposed by one of the directors former directors, I think former directors of the University of Michigan Survey Research Center. Oh no, this was George Katona. He was the second founder of this theory, George Katona. Behavior changes to achieve a desired outcome, and this is the psychologist Skinner, who did the Skinner experiments. You can Google that. Social phenomena ought to be considered systems, Bertalanffy. This is from our text in one of our classes. And governments need to make sure aggregate demand is sufficient to maintain full employment. And this is Skidelsky, who did a biography on Keynes, the economist. And this is his hypothesis, saying that he believes that governments have a job, and that their job is to make sure that there is aggregate demand. Because as long as there's aggregate demand in society, people will want to spend money, which is good for the economy. I had 3 research questions. Um, actually, I had 1 research question, which was which variables are correlated with and influence aggregate consumer sentiment. Then I had 3 sub-questions. Sub-question 1 was which variables impact the public's perception of the state of the economy? What are people's perceptions of the state of the economy? Do people have the economic literacy to confirm economic conditions? But the main research question guiding the study is this one. What variables are correlated with and influence aggregate sentiment? Methodology is my chapter 3. I indicated that, for example, it was mentioned by one of my committee members that I should concentrate my dissertation here in Broward County, and I thought that was a bad idea. And it was also a bad idea to look at Florida, because when you look at the whole country, the top 5, Florida was one of the top 5 states with the highest unemployment. So I'm bound to, in the research design process, I decided that I wasn't going to use the entire state of Florida as my population, because it was bound to be skewed. Okay, if you pull a respondent from Florida and from another state, it's bound to be different. Also, it's not representative of the U.S. population. Frequent instances of mortgage, health insurance, and investment fraud happen in Florida. I wanted to avoid skewedness, and I wanted to add more states to be consistent with the norm of this kind of research. So I didn't just want to do Broward County because I wanted to do I wanted to have the same sample size that the index of consumer sentiment has, and that the consumer price index had, which is 500 people. So I wanted anyone from a major research institute to look at my research and go, wow, this person did was able to acquire a population comparable to what we do. So this person is research worthy. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind also, that when you revisit the study that you do a year or 5 years later, are you going to say to yourself, I could have done a better job. I could have gotten more participants, right? Or when you're sitting with someone in a job interview and you tell them about your sample, are they going to ask you, well, why couldn't you have gotten more people? Did you just limit it to a certain region because it was easier? How much effort are you willing to put in to our job if you put in this amount of effort into your study? So these are all things that I kept in mind. So then I looked at the entire US, and I'm happy to say that I got people from every single state except for North Dakota. And I put a little funny slide saying that it's probably because nobody lives in North Dakota, anyways. My sample, my original goal was to obtain 400 participants. When I distributed my study, I ended up with 748 people who started the assessment, but not all of them completed it. And I ended up with 535 valid responses, which basically means that they completed every single question. They were all over the age of 18. Okay. There were 45 questions. It includes the questions from the Index of Consumer Sentiment, questions from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, some demographic questions, and some percent chance questions, which is actually called subjective probability in statistics. And you can look into that because that's actually the correct way and the way to measure how people feel when you're doing a study. Subjective probability. In the Index of Consumer Sentiment, there's 5 main questions. Question number 1 is, we're interested in how people are getting along financially these days. Would you say that you and your family living there are better off or worse off than you were a year ago? Question 2, looking ahead, do you think that a year from now you and your family will be better off financially or worse off, or just about the same as now? Turning to business conditions, do you feel we're better off or worse off? Looking ahead, what would you say is more likely, that the country will have good times or bad times? So basically, each one of these questions, and the last question, about big things people buy for their homes. Do you think now is a good time or a bad time to buy major household items? So for each one of these questions, according to the Index of Consumer Sentiment, people can either give you a positive response, a negative response, or a neutral response. Okay. And this is the way that they calculate the formula for the Index of Consumer Sentiment. They take depending on how they answer to each question, positive responses get a score of 200, negative answers get a score of 0, and neutral answers get a score of 100. So then you put each one of these 3 scores here, 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 and here. You add them all up and divide it by 6.7558, and then there's another number here that's added. I think it was 3 point something 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 to offset some changes that were done over time. And then that gives you an index of consumer sentiment for the participant, which is a gauge of how they rank in terms of consumer sentiment. These are the variables that I tested. The index score, which is the dependent variable in my study, which is this right here, the index score. And then I measured that versus pretty much everything else. Their state, political affiliation, religion, gender, age, education level, personal, household, and discretionary income as 3 separate things, marital status, household size, race, percent correct on the economic literacy score, the 5 questions ICS. Well, this is actually here, anyways. This is this. The parent's level of education, employment status, perception of others' willingness to commit a crime, participants' willingness to commit a crime, the hours you watch TV, how many hours do you watch the news, news network preference, experience with and knowledge of others, bankruptcy, foreclosure, layoffs, safe walking in the neighborhood, percent of trust in government to fix economy, and what does the American dream mean? So each one of these are either at the nominal, the ordinal, or the interval ratio level. Nominal means that it's like a word that they can get to pick from. State, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Alaska, right? You cannot add these or you cannot divide them because they are nominal variables. Interval ratio are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They're interval, right? Age. Um, your willingness to commit a crime because I'm asked participants to give me a number from 0 to 100. So this is subjective probability here. The number of TV hours, the number of news hours, all of that, right? So I did my survey through SurveyMonkey. This is what it looked like. It had my consent letter here. Um, the first question was the state of residence. Then I asked, what's your political affiliation? And I gave them options. What's your religious affiliation? And they get to pick. What is your gender? And then I included transgender because we are in the year 2015. We have to stop ignoring the fact that we do have transgender people in our world, okay? So there's other cultures that recognize transgender as a category. We're in the USA. We need to catch up with the rest of the world, okay? What is your age? And then I asked them to type in the number. What is your highest level of education? So then I gave them options. And if you look at these, it's already ordered from least education to most education. To the nearest thousand, what's your income before taxes? And then they type it in. To the nearest thousand, what is your total household income before taxes? And then I also asked this one, which proved to be very important. Please tell me your estimated discretional income per month. And then I put here, discretional income is the money you have left over after all household expenses and bills have been paid per month. So then this is like a number that you put. What is your current marital status? Oh, okay. What is your current marital status? Single, never married, engaged, and I put engaged as a marital status because if you take this survey and you're engaged, you're technically single because you're not married yet. But if you feel married, you might put married, but I wanted more accuracy. You could be married but separated and not divorced, divorced or widowed, and I don't think there's anything else aside from these. Including yourself, how many people live in your house? Tell me about your race and ethnicity. How do you identify yourself? Now, what's funny is that typically for this question, you would expect people to have a list: white, Hispanic, black, Indian, right? But I ask people to identify, and when you open that and you ask people to I self-identify, I got 119 different responses in at the end of my dissertation. So if this is an important variable to you, don't do what I did. If it really doesn't matter, you can leave it open, and it's interesting to see how many different type of identities there are. And if you look at the American Anthropological Association, they have a big study about race and how we shouldn't use race because we're all the same anyways, and race has a lot of hateful connotation and has a very bloody history in our country. The 13th question, I asked people to identify this man. This is Bernie Madoff. He's being arrested for fraud. Um, I asked who this guy is. Who is this guy? Well, this guy, anyways. This is Bernie Madoff, and these are chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. So people were given the chance to say, I don't know if they don't know who the person is. I didn't give them any clues, and I didn't do multiple choice because there is a percent chance that you can guess the right answer. And my objective was to make sure that I found out how much you knew. This is Ben Bernanke. I just remembered his name. And this is Alan Greenspan. Just remembered. It's coming back to me now. In terms of economics, what does GDP stand for? And this was all part of a mini quiz that I designed for them. I told them in the beginning in the consent form, it asked to please give honest responses. If you really don't know, just put IDK or I don't know, or just leave it blank or put whatever. In terms of economics, what does CPI stand for? And this is Consumer Price Index. Economically speaking, off the top of your head, can you tell me what inflation means? And then people will put what they think inflation means. How many quarters of decline is necessary for there to be a recession? So now in in the National Assessment of Educational Progress, they only give you these 4 responses. But if you know that it's definitely not 1/4 and you know it's definitely not 4/4, if you guess, you're going to have a 50% chance of guessing this right. So to eliminate that possibility, I added more parts to it. And this decreased your chance of guessing correctly to about 9%. Question 20, please refer to the chart below titled Dara's Shop. And then this is like a little quiz question. Then this one asks about equilibrium price. This one asks to identify what the Federal Reserve can do to reduce inflationary pressures. And then these are just some other questions from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is a test that's distributed to 12th graders by the Institute of Educational Science through the Department of Education. And their job is to assess whether or not 12th graders are financially and economically literate. These questions here that say better off, worse off, about the same, these are the questions for the Index of Consumer Sentiment. Question 29, if our economy continuously declines over the next few years, what's the percent chance you think people with no means will begin to steal and break the law? People put in a percentage. Mother and father's highest level of education. Employment status. Now, I added a couple categories because I'm not happy with how people ask this question. If you are unemployed, that doesn't mean that you got fired or laid off. You could be a medical student on your 3rd year and you're older, but you're not working yet. So I wanted to capture as many possibilities as I could. Unemployed and not searching, unemployed and searching, employed part-time and searching full-time, employed part-time not seeking full-time, or employed full-time. I purposely left out retired from here. I could have added it. I would have probably gotten like 2. One person did ask me why didn't I put it? And then I said, if you are retired, you are unemployed and not searching for a job. 33, if your household were unable to obtain employment and you realize that employment continues to rise, what's the percent chance that you will steal or break the law? Now, what was interesting here for this question is I wanted to see what is the person's likelihood to commit a crime if they had to provide for their family. And what I noticed, which was pretty cool for the field of conflict analysis, is that people who said, I will absolutely never ever steal, 0% chance that I will steal, also said in their justification that they have family that they can provide, that they can turn to. People who said anything that 10% or 20% or 50 or whatever, they didn't say that they have family to turn to. So that is an interesting thing if anybody wants to look into assessing criminal characteristics or something like that. Maybe you can do that. Maybe like an assessment to predict crime. I don't know. Question 34, on average, how many hours do you watch TV? You type in the number. I refrain from putting in like the ranges, like 1 to 5 hours, 6 to 10 hours. Why? Because from 1 to 5, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units. From 6 to 10, there's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 units. But what about between 5 and 6? It's just a unit of 1, right? It's just a difference of 1 unit. So a difference of 1 unit could be the difference between saying that you watch 1 hour of TV per week or 10 hours of TV per week, which is no TV at all pretty much and a whole lot of TV, maybe. So I wanted them to type that out. How many hours do you spend watching the news or reading it online? Major news network affiliation. Have you personally experienced foreclosure? Personally experienced bankruptcy? Do you know someone who's undergone foreclosure? Do you know someone who's undergone bankruptcy? Have you lost your job or do you know someone who's lost your job? Speaking specifically of your neighborhood, do you feel that people are safe walking around alone? Multiple choice. What's the percent chance you think the government officials will make the economy better in the years to come? Then they provide a percentage. And then what does the American dream mean to you? The reason why I put this question is because it was basically like a dummy question to see whether or not they were actually done with the survey. So hopefully my participants by this point were pumped up and excited about my survey so that they wrote stuff. And I had essays. People submitted essays. And this was a good sign because it gave me the realization that the responses weren't bogus, and it also gave me some content for a future study if I chose to do one. Statistical methods, I was considering hierarchical regression or logistic regression, but then I said no because it integrates a step method in all variables in a model's predictive ability. Typically, it's using binary categorical data that requires coding. So for when I was getting ready to do chapter 3, I also evaluated other different statistical methods that I could have used that I've seen being used in the literature, and I explained why I don't use them. Then I decided to use correlation instead because measures of correlation between the two variables. So since I'm measuring consumer sentiment with other variables, then I thought that it was best to use that. So then the question became, what do I use, Pearson's R or Spearman's Rho? Because these are two common types of correlations. So I created like a mini, like a couple slides worth of explaining Pearson's R correlation, and I did like an example here because I also am interested in like epidemiological research, so I do a lot of reading on that too. So I gave an example here of a cup of coffee, and I did the Pearson's correlation manually, right? And the objective of Pearson's correlation is to give you a line and tell you the strength of that line, basically. So the example that I have is like, let's suppose you have 1 cup of coffee and you have 1 teaspoon of sugar, which has 16 calories. So for 1 teaspoon of sugar, you have 16 calories. For 2 teaspoons of sugar, you have 32 calories, etc., right? And then I work out the formula. So let me get rid of these markings. Okay, so basically here I worked out the formula and I worked it out, and I determined that the Pearson's correlation was 1, right? There's a 1-in-1 relationship between the number of teaspoons of sugar and the amount of calories. As one unit goes up, the other unit goes this way. So for every 1 teaspoon of sugar, you get 16 calories, and it goes incrementally like that, a perfect correlation. Spearman's Rho is a little different. The formula is 1 minus 6 and the sum of d squared over n, and then in parentheses n squared minus 1. So d is the difference between the rank of x and the rank of y. So I started to like this a little better, and I made an example with the Ninja Turtles and tried to identify the relationship between how fit they are and how friendly they are. So then when I worked out that, and I did a lot of reading about Spearman's Rho and really try to learn it by hand so that I can explain it better, the correlation came out to be 0.80. So I like Spearman's Rho better than I like Spearman's Rho better than Pearson's R because what Spearman's Rho does is it creates like an imaginary boundary between your data. So like when you have here Pearson's R, it assumes, right, you have all these little scatters, it assumes indefinite growth. For every 1 teaspoon I add another 16. But realistically speaking, I'm not gonna add 1,000 teaspoons of sugar to my 1 cup of coffee. I'm gonna run out of room. Pearson's R is used a lot in the chemical and in the physical sciences, so things that are non-human. But when you're ranking humans from least to most, this makes a little bit more sense because you can rank them from least friendly to most friendly, from least fit to most fit. Results was my chapter 4. I separated my results into 2 parts, descriptive statistics and then inferential statistics. So here I just provided some graphs. This is the quiz score for the assessment that I provided to see how financially literate my people were, my survey participants. Sorry, it sounded a little dictatorial there, my people. All right, so then quiz score, we have here the mean, which was 0.52. So a lot of them got it wrong, got those questions wrong. So you know that show, Are You Smarter Than a 5th Grader? This is kind of like, Are You Smarter Than a 12th Grader? Not a lot of people really knew about things about the economy, so it is consistent with that other quote and that other study that indicates that people who take economic quizzes for for the major economic measures don't really know about the economy to begin with. This was the index of consumer sentiment. It ranked from 0 up to 150. These are people who are very pessimistic about the state of the economy and people who are overly optimistic. The average was about 80, which is around here in the middle of the normal distribution. This is the a distribution of people who trust the government. The mean is 34%. So people who trust the government to improve economic conditions, not so much. There are some people who do believe that the government is going to help, but for the most part, it lies right here. Not the most of the population doesn't feel that the government is going to be doing a good job of helping to restore the economy. Age, I was able to do this kind of normal distribution, just so you know, because I refrained from using multiple choice. So that's why this is important in how you're going to ask your questions. Because, for example, if I know that a participant here is 37 years old, period, it ends right there, end of story. If I wanted to provide ranges, I could take this data and create ranges myself. But if I ask for the range and I try to go back in a few years and try to do another study and I really wanted to know how old that participant was, I'll never know. So that's why it's also important for you to keep in mind. Um, it's important for you to keep in mind the type of questions that you're asking and whether or not the data is going to be useful to you in the future. This is a distribution of the personal income question, and I also removed some outliers because one person in my study did make $1 million. It was a much older person, so I do believe it. Some people made 600,000, 800. So I did have people on this side. This is indicative of the top 1%, if you would like to think of it that way. And then when I remove the outliers of the data, which is removing incomes of 200,000 to a million, then this is what you see. So then this is kind of like you're looking at it from way far away, and then when you step closer, this is the reality of most of the population. They earn, on average, $46,000 a year. Then household income, I did the same thing. There were household incomes of $1 million, $2.5 million as a household. The average was 83,000. So I removed these outliers of 500,000 to 2 million, and this is what you get. Then I asked this one, monthly discretionary income, which looks like to be from 0 to 10,000. But most people live what we call, quote, paycheck to paycheck. So I knew that this wasn't the reality, that we all have $10,000 at the end of the month to spend. So when I removed the outliers of $10,000 to $30,000 per month in disposable income, which is discretionary income, then you get this from 0 to about 4,000, with the average being $1,000 of discretionary income. This was the percent chance that people think others will commit a crime if they have to. This is people's willingness to commit a crime. So as you can see, there's people who said 100%, 80%, 60. So this is kind of like, they're already telling you that if they're in a bad financial situation, that they are willing to commit a crime. So this was also something important for me to know for my study. Number of TV hours, number of hours watching the news. So people watch more TV in general, but not so much of those hours are spent watching the news. Then I did the inferential statistics, and this is really the meat of the study. I had people from all states, and these are the frequencies. You can see that I have, like about this is the index of consumer sentiment. So you can see the index of consumer sentiment as in comparison by state. So as you can see, people in Nevada are pretty happy. People in Louisiana aren't that happy. Nebraska, Missouri, North Carolina, New York, Washington, D.C. are more optimistic about their economic future. So is West Virginia. So then this shows you that remember that first graphic that I showed you in illustrating that I didn't want to just study Florida by itself? Well, here's Florida. Here's Florida's consumer sentiment. And then look at the volatility here. So there's a great difference between states. So I'm glad that I did a national study. This was consumer sentiment by political affiliation. Democrats are more happy about the state of the economy than Republicans are, and people who identify as independent. By religion, the most satisfied in the state of the economy are Hindus, except there's only 3 Hindus in the study. But if you omit this outlier, it kind of hovers in the high 80s and 90s. By gender identity, I actually had 3 transgenders respond. Males and females are almost the same, but transgender people feel less confident about their economic futures than males and females do. So maybe that's like another topic to discuss later in the future. So you kind of see how like each one of these graphs can provide another research question for another study, and that's really what I wanted to do. Average sentiment by level of education. When you're in high school, you're optimistic. When you're after some college, and then with an associate's degree, it kind of goes down. But then look what happens; it shoots up when you have a bachelor's degree, and then just kind of levels out. So this can conclude that people with a bachelor's degree or higher are more optimistic about their financial future or their economic future than people who have an associate's degree. It's probably because the trend is now that the associate's degree, it's really hard to find a job with an associate's degree only. Now they expect you to have a bachelor's or a master's and higher. And in doing the Spearman's rho correlation, I found that the correlation is significant at the 95% confidence interval, and that the correlation is 0.093, which is a weak correlation, but it illustrates that the higher your education, the more confident you are about the state of the economy. I did this again with marital status. People who are engaged are more optimistic about their economic future. People who are widowed are not. So then, as you can see, there is a relationship between your how you feel about the state of the economy and your marital status. People who are divorced, married but separated, and married are kind of equal almost. If you're single, never married, or engaged, you're kind of high up there. So um, after getting your finances involved with another person, this is when your consumer sentiment dips a little bit. And then when you lose that spouse, that's when it dips even further. Consumer sentiment by household size, we have one genius that put 2.8, and then one person responded that they have 8 people in the household. But when you remove these, you can kind of see that it's almost the same. There isn't really a whole lot of volatility there. But people with no kids at all are more happy or more satisfied about the state or more optimistic about the state of the economy than people who have kids. Economic literacy, it's easy to see that this line goes up, which basically means that for every 1 point increase in the economic literacy quiz that I give, it increases your index of consumer sentiment by 16.36 points. So the more you know about the state of the economy, the more satisfied you'll be, but not really, because it's almost flat. So it's it's significant at the 95% confidence interval. By parents' level of education, actually, this is one of the studies, one of the variables that actually showed, interestingly, that it doesn't have an influence. So whether your parents are in high school or they're doctors or surgeons or lawyer, these two were the variables that had absolutely no relationship to consumer sentiment at all. So it's interesting to see that like the factors who that kind of like were before you, such as your parents and your parents' wealth and your parents' background, does not have an influence. So you are a unit yourself that perceives the economy who is not influenced by your past, and that's a striking finding. Um, by employment status, people who are employed full time are much more satisfied than people who are unemployed in both searching and non-searching categories, and people who are working part time. But if you're working part time and you're not seeking employment, you're more optimistic than the rest. If you're employed part time minimally and seeking full time employment, you're just as optimistic or pessimistic, I should say, about the state of the economy. By news network preference, the main finding that I had is that people who watch NBC and CNN and all these others, you see 80s, 90, 80, 80, right? Fox News has 69. So this kind of like also showed that people who watch Fox News are less likely to spend money than people who watch NBC or CNN or any other news network. So in terms of looking at unemployment figures, should news networks be accountable for basically defaming political figures or for purposefully influencing aggregate perceptions, because for every time that they influence a person or a viewer to not spend any money, they're causing harm to the economy. So should news networks be accountable? Should they know this? How do we present this to them? That's for another study, not mine. Average sentiment, personally experienced foreclosure versus knowing someone who's undergone foreclosure. And then I did someone who experienced bankruptcy or know someone who's undergone bankruptcy. Personally experienced laid off, someone who knows. In either one of these three scenarios, what was interesting is that if you know someone who's undergone a layoff, it's going to be less. If you know someone who's undergone a bankruptcy, it's less. And if you know someone who's undergone foreclosure, it's less. So in all three examples, if you at minimum know someone, not necessarily if you've experienced it, because if you've experienced foreclosure, your consumer sentiment is like almost equal than those who have not. But if you know of someone, it seems to me like that alone has the ability to prevent you from being optimistic about the economy. Feeling safe in your own neighborhood. You can see, I don't know, I normally am a big fan of not ever using neutral in your assessment. I think that since neutrality lacks optimism, it is pessimism, and it also lacks pessimism, so is it optimism. So I think if you remove the neutral category, you will force your participants to pick something else, and they will give you the response that more accurately depicts what they feel. So if you look at all of these minus neutral, you will see that the trend goes downwards. The less safe you feel in your neighborhood, the less your consumer sentiment score. If you feel that the economy will make things better, the higher you have trust in the government, the higher your score is. The higher your age, the less confident you feel about the state of the economy. The higher your personal income, with and without outliers, the more confident you are about the state of the economy. If your household is higher, then you feel better about the state of the economy. Discretionary income was an interesting one, because it shows here also that the higher your discretionary income, the higher your consumer sentiment score, the more optimistic you are about the state of the economy. But this one, even though it almost looks like a flat line, it was one of the strongest statistically correlated at the 99% confidence interval. If you feel others will break the law, if unemployment and bad financial times occur, the less you trust others, basically, the less optimistic you are about the state of the economy. If you are willing to commit a crime, then the higher your percentage. You see that there's a lot of disparity here in comparison to this one. So it kind of seems like there's a lot more consistency in the response. Either you're 50% willing to commit a crime, 100%, or between 0 and 20% willing to commit a crime. But the more willing you are to commit a crime, the less your consumer sentiment score is, meaning the more pessimistic you are. By hours of TV watch and news watch per week, it's almost flat. So these were the summary of my findings. I produced this myself. SPSS did not do this. And I organized this by significance level. So these here are significant at the 99% confidence interval. These are significant at the 95% confidence interval. And these were not statistically significant at all. So the number of hours per week, your mother's level of education, your father's level of education, how many hours you watch of news per week has absolutely no impact on consumer sentiment. Your level of education, how much you know about the state of the economy, your household size, and your household income has. So then, if you look, these are kind of like factors that are a little bit outside of your control. You can't control the content you watch on TV or the news content. You didn't control your parents' level of education. But these are things that are more specific to you as an individual, your household size, your income. Now, this is even more personal, I think. Your age, your percent chance that you would commit a crime, the trust that you have that other people will commit a crime, your personal income, the trust that you have in the government to fix the economy, and your monthly discretionary income, which is the highest one. Okay, it is a weak correlation, but it's the strongest. The strongest one statistically, um, as well as this one, the trust that you have in the government. So then these two were the most important and the most correlated. So then chapter 5 here, this is the conclusion. Um, I started by talking about some implications. There's frequent inconsistencies among categorical data. So like state, um, I had 100 participants in the state of Florida because I'm from Florida. One participant from Alaska only, so you got to keep that in mind when you're looking at your results. Settling on a statistical method was a bit challenging. People are never static, and even within categories that divide people, individuals behave uniquely and different from one another. Over 24,000 plus individual responses to analyze, so it did take me a very long time to um, download the information from SPSS and clean it up, because I actually had to go through every single one of these data iterations or these responses and clean it up to make sure it was consistent. So like for in some places where I asked for your income, some people maybe would put $10,000 like this. Some people would put $10,000 like that, or they would write it like this, right? Or for my South American people, they would write it like this. For some other creative people, they put 10 G's. Also, I know what that means, but that's how they wrote it. So I had to make this into a consistent format, and it was a bit challenging, but it was worthwhile because I was able to get the analysis that I got. So as I sat back and I did all this, I created this, which is a theoretical framework that students of social science, of conflict analysis, of any subject really, can look at it and test it to see if the cycle of aggregate sentiment is applicable. So this is what I created, and the theory is this: that there are certain variables and conditions that influence your sentiment, how you feel about that thing or that topic or that theme. Your sentiment can either be positive or negative. If you have positive sentiment, you're going to react a certain way. If you have negative sentiment, you're going to react a certain way. And this sentiment leads to action, right? So in the discussion about consumer sentiment, if you're positive about the state of the economy, then you're going to spend money and you're going to save less money. If you're pessimistic about the state of the economy, you're going to save more and spend less. So there's like a stimulus and a response relationship, and that's what I'm trying to highlight here. So then this individual action falls into like a bucket of aggregate social action. So then this action is your action, but in reality, it captures the actions of everyone else here. This aggregate social action is then pushed and then becomes a social reality. So if everyone's action is to save money and spend less, then the social reality is going to eventually be the outcomes of that aggregate social action. So people are going to spend less money. If they spend less money, people demand is down for products and services. If product and services are down, unemployment is going to go high. People are going to lay off people, and then that becomes a social reality. So now what happens is that people in society are going to become aware of their social reality, and then this awareness of social reality will become eventually one of the conditions and variables that influence your sentiment. So this is the outcome of my dissertation is creation of this theory, which can be tested, and in qualitative or quantitative studies alike. Discussion and recommendations. I also provide a section here. Research was successful in identifying variables that are statistically related with consumer sentiment. Reinforces the notion of the consumer being the source of economic and social strength. Aggregate sentiment is undeniably influenced by certain factors. Future researchers can apply the same approach to understand how people feel towards any theme and understand which variables influence their behavior. And there's a guy named Charles Mackay. He wrote a book called Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and Madness of the Crowds. So he identified something called crowd madness. And crowd madness is like, you have one person here, for example, and then there's other people around, and then this person screams and then runs, ah, right? And then that kind of like spreads the madness of the crowd. Popular delusions also is like a fad. This is like one of the earliest written works of fads. Um, so his work was written to collect the most remarkable instances of those moral epidemics which have been excited, sometimes by one cause and sometimes by another, and to show how easily the masses have been led astray and how imitative and gregarious men are, even in their infatuations and crimes. So Charles Mackay was like the me of the 1840s because he studied aggregate sentiment in his time, and he was interested in collecting all of the popular delusions and crowd madness into a series of books, which I still have yet to collect all of them, but I'm in the process of working on that. But then this is essentially how I ended my dissertation, and then I put my references towards the end, right? Quite a bit. And in total, I had exactly 100 slides. But as you can see, I kind of like, for a lot of these that have like charts and stuff, I didn't spend way too much time. So, like for example, in the cover, I spent a minute here, 2 minutes here. I don't know if you can see the times, but like, I tried to keep it so make it so it's balanced out. When I get to these charts, it's like I try to get as close to 30 seconds as I possibly could so that the presentation doesn't run that long. And when you get to your references, you don't really present your references. So that's like slides 89 to 100 anyways. So again, the objective of this is I just wanted to create like a video to show you how I put together my dissertation presentation, why I selected the methodology, also how I aligned the book's chapters with the presentation so that it flowed nicely from introduction to lit review to methodology and then results and conclusion. And if you have any questions about this, you can always feel free to email me at letamend at nova.edu, Letamend at nova.edu, and I'll be more than happy to help you out. Or if you have any other contributions to the study of aggregate sentiment, or you're interested in partnering or anything like that, feel free to let me know and I'll be more than happy to work with you. Thanks and have a great day.